I'm 84 years old, and I want to tell you something I should have understood much earlier. The past is not dangerous because it hurts. The past is dangerous because it can become more beautiful than the life you are actually living. And once that happens, you are no longer remembering, you are no longer grieving, you are no longer honoring something that mattered. You are hiding in it. And that is exactly what I did, for more years than I want to admit. Now let me ask you something very honestly. Have you ever carried someone in your heart for so long that they stopped feeling like a memory and started feeling like a second life? A life you never really had, a life you kept returning to in your mind, a life that felt softer, cleaner, more meaningful than the one in front of you. If you have, then stay with me, because what I am about to say is not only about first love, it is about unfinished stories, fantasy, longing, regret, and the quiet, terrible cost of loving something that no longer exists more than the life that still does. I was 18 when I first met him. His name was Thomas, and even now, all these decades later, I can still see that first moment if I allow myself to. Not because memory is holy, because certain moments brand themselves into the nervous system. Summer light, dust floating in the late afternoon, a white shirt with the sleeves rolled, a face that did not look extraordinary until he looked directly at me. And then something inside me changed. I was young then. The age when one conversation can feel like destiny. The age when being deeply seen for the first time feels almost unbearable. And that is what he gave me. Attention, real attention. He listened to me as if what I said had weight. At 18, that felt like love. Maybe it was. Or maybe it was the first time I felt witnessed in a way that made me believe I was larger than the life I had grown up in. We were not together for very long. That is one of the strangest parts of this whole story. If I tell you the length of it, you may think, how could something so short matter so much? But life does not measure meaning the way calendars do. Some people stay 10 years and leave no mark on your soul. Some people stay one season and leave you emotionally rearranged for life. That was Thomas. We talked, we walked, we made the kind of foolish, beautiful plans young people make when they have not yet been introduced to time. We believed feeling something deeply was enough. We believed promises were stronger than circumstance. We believed if two people wanted each other enough, life would eventually move out of the way. That is how youth thinks. Then life did what life always does. It interrupted. His family moved. There were promises to write, promises to wait, promises to return, and then silence. Not dramatic betrayal, not some cruel scene in the rain, just the kind of ending that leaves no proper grave. That is what makes some stories so hard to bury. They do not end cleanly, they remain open, and anything left open has a way of continuing inside the mind. I waited at first, then I pretended not to, then I built a life, or at least that is what it looked like from the outside. I married, I had children, I cooked meals, washed clothes, paid bills, held babies, buried one parent, then another, went to weddings, sat through illnesses, kept a home running, stood in photographs, smiling the smile women have worn for generations when life is asking more from them than anyone can see. And in many ways, it was a good life. That is important. I am not one of those people who says, my whole life was false. No, it was real. It had beauty in it, love in it, responsibility in it, ordinary grace in it. But somewhere inside me, there remained one private room. And in that room, Thomas was still young, still unfinished, still waiting for the story to continue. And because he remained unfinished, he remained perfect. Do you understand that danger? Real people age, real people disappoint, real people get tired, distracted, sick, irritable, ordinary. But the people we freeze in memory do not change. They remain lit by the soft light of longing. And over time, we stop loving the person. We begin loving the version preserved by our own ache. That is what happened to me. I did not carry a man. I carried a possibility, a question, a fantasy. What if? That question ruined more in me than I knew. Because while I was feeding that question, something else was happening quietly. My real life was being measured against an imaginary one, and no real life survives that comparison gracefully. My husband was a decent man, faithful, steady, reliable, the kind of man many women would have been grateful to marry. And I was grateful. I want to be fair about that. But gratitude and full presence are not always the same thing. There were moments when he was beside me, and I was not fully beside him. He would reach for me, and something in me would compare him to a ghost, not because he had failed, because ghosts never become ordinary. That is their power, and that is their cruelty, because real life is ordinary, marriage is ordinary, raising children is ordinary, aging together is ordinary, and if you are secretly loyal to a fantasy, the ordinary begins to feel smaller than it should. That was the theft. Not that I remembered Thomas, that while remembering him, I gave less of myself to the life actually unfolding in front of me. That is a painful thing to admit at 84, but age has made me less interested in protecting my image and more interested in telling the truth. So let me tell you the truth plainly. If part of your heart is living in a beautiful old story, the people in your present life will feel your absence, even if you never say a word. They may not know the name, they may not know the history, but they will feel the distance. My husband felt it. I know that now. He never accused me, never made a scene, never asked the exact question. But once, many years into our marriage, he said something I did not understand properly at the time. He said, "Sometimes I feel like part of you is in another room I cannot enter." At the time, I smiled sadly and said he was imagining things. He wasn't. He was describing something I had not yet had the courage to face. There was a room, and I kept it locked, not because I wanted to hurt him, because I was afraid that if I opened that room and let the light in, I would have to admit that the great unfinished love of my youth had become less about him and more about my attachment to who I believed I once was. That is another hard truth. Sometimes we are not holding on to a person. We are holding on to the version of ourselves who still believed life had infinite directions left. That younger self feels precious, unwounded, open, alive with possibility. And if you are not careful, you start visiting that younger self through the memory of the person attached to them. I think that is what I was really doing. Not longing for Thomas exactly, longing for the girl I was before the world became practical, before duty replaced imagination, before life became something to manage instead of something to feel. Years passed, then more years. Then my husband died, and grief does strange things to memory. It opens old drawers. It lets hidden things come up like objects floating to the surface of dark water. In the silence after his death, I began thinking of Thomas again, more strongly than I had in years. Not because I loved my husband less, because loss makes the mind search for unfinished things, perhaps because unfinished things still seem capable of answering us. And then, through one of these modern foolishnesses I still barely understand, I found him. Or perhaps I should say, A version of him appeared on a screen in front of me. Older face, gray hair, glasses, lines life had written across him, and yet it was unmistakably him. My hands shook. At that moment, I was no longer an old widow in a quiet room. I was 18 again. That is the danger of unresolved longing. It can make an old body feel suddenly inhabited by a young ache. So I wrote to him, a careful message, dignified words carrying undignified hope. He answered, and a week later we met. Now listen to me very carefully, because this is where the lesson truly begins. When I saw him walk in, I knew immediately that the person I had carried for all those years no longer existed. There was a real man in front of me, an old man, a man with his own griefs, his own marriages, his own disappointments, his own habits, his own silences, his own version of what the years had done. He was kind, he was warm, he was glad to see me, but he was not the boy from my memory, and I was not the girl he had once kissed under summer light. We were two old people meeting in the ruins of a story that had lived too long in imagination. We sat down, we talked, and then I asked the question that had lived in me for more than 60 years. Why didn't you write? He looked at me for a long time. Then he said something that made my whole body go cold. I did. I stared at him. He said he wrote many times. He waited too. He thought I had chosen silence. I thought the same of him. For decades, both of us had lived inside a wound built from misunderstanding. And for a brief moment, I thought this discovery would heal something. I thought maybe this was the grand answer, the missing key, the proof that all those years of remembering had meant something profound. But the truth was sadder and wiser than that. We did not become young again. We did not become soulmates reunited by fate. We became two old people sitting with the knowledge that memory had been larger than reality for both of us. And then he told me something that broke me more deeply than the lost letters ever could have. He said, I had to let you go. If I hadn't, I would have missed the life I still had. There it was, the whole truth. He had done what I never fully did. He had grieved, and then he had lived. I had remembered, and then half lived. Do you hear the difference? That is the real tragedy. Not that I loved him once, that I never fully stopped building an inner chapel to what might have been, and while doing that, I gave less than my full self to what actually was. I went home that day and sat in silence for hours. Then I took out a photograph of my husband, and I cried in a way I had not even cried at the funeral. Because for the first time, I understood what my loyalty had hidden from me. I had been faithful in the practical sense. I had been present in the physical sense. I had done my duty. But duty is not the same as wholehearted presence. And wholehearted presence is what the people we love deserve. My husband had given me a real life, not a fantasy, a real one. Breakfasts, bills, children, tired evenings, inside jokes, shared worry, ordinary devotion, a human life. And too often, I had secretly measured that life against a story no real life could survive being compared to. That is not romance. That is a failure of gratitude. And old age, if it is honest, will eventually force that truth into your hands. Let me ask you something now. Is there someone from your past who still lives too comfortably inside you? A first love? A missed chance? A city you never moved to? A version of yourself you still keep visiting? And if so, what is it costing your present life? Whose hand are you only half holding? Whose love are you receiving with only half of yourself available? Who is paying the price for a fantasy that feels private to you? Because fantasies are never private for long. They leak into marriages, into parenting, into the emotional availability of a person, into gratitude, into peace. The past is not dangerous because it happened. It is dangerous when you start treating it like home. You cannot live in memory without abandoning something real. That is the lesson I learned too late. When I saw Thomas again, he became real. And the moment he became real, the fantasy died. Do you know what died with it? Not only the dream, my excuse. My private, beautiful excuse for not fully belonging to the life I already had. After that meeting, I stopped calling him my lost love in my mind. He was not that. He was a meaningful chapter, a tender season, a true young heartbreak. But he was not the answer to my life. He was not my destiny. He was not the person fate cruelly stole from me. He was simply a person I had loved once, and then used for decades as a container for all the beauty, freedom, and possibility I feared I had lost in myself. That is very different. And once I understood that, I felt two things at the same time: deep grief and deep relief. Grief for the years I had spent looking backward. Relief that at last I could stop. At 84, stopping matters. Because at this age, time becomes loud. You begin to understand with painful clarity that what remains should not be spent kneeling at the altar of things that no longer exist. The people in front of you are what matter. The life in front of you is what matters. The real, if you honor it properly, is worth more than the imagined every time. If you are carrying something from your past, I am not telling you to deny it. I am telling you to tell the truth about it. Was it meaningful? Yes. Was it real? Probably. Was it worth remembering? Of course. But is it worth feeding so long that it begins draining the color from your actual life? Never. Do not build a second life in your imagination and then wonder why the real one feels dim. Do not spend your years searching emotionally for someone you have already turned into a story. Stories are beautiful, but people are what matter. I'm 84 years old, and if I could place one final truth in your hands, it would be this: let the past be sacred if it must, but do not let it become your home. Because the people who love you in the present should never have to compete with someone who only survives because memory never allowed them to become ordinary. Come back. Come back to the life you still have. Come back to the people who are still here. Come back before the cost becomes regret. Because regret at this age is heavy. And the sad thing is, most of it was preventable. Thank you for listening to me. And if your heart is still living in a place your body left decades ago, come back now, before it costs you more than you know.